So, hello and welcome back to what is probably our final night with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We have only two chapters left, although they are pretty long ones for this book anyway. Um, it's kind of interesting that so much of the beginning of this novel felt really slow, but things seem to definitely be ramping up now with a dead body in Dr. Jekyll's laboratory and a missing Dr. Jekyll, who seems to have written a letter to Utterson, his lawyer, instructing him to go home and read what his friend Dr. Lanyon, the man who died recently, had written to him to be opened upon the death or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll. So it looks like things are finally coming together and we're finally going to see exactly what is up in this book. Like I said, we have two chapters left in this wonderful story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, by Robert Louis Stevenson and written all the way back in 1886. So this is a very old one. Speaking of written in 1886, I'm starting to think that this book was printed not too long after 1886 because it's definitely an antique. Hopefully, I am not destroying it too badly because bookbinding is not one of my skills, at least not yet. Anyway, we are going to jump back into chapter 7. I think it's 7. I should probably count that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, this is chapter 9. I'm silly. We're going to jump back into chapter 9 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is titled Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when, if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend on you, I would not have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose after this preface that I'm going to ask for something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone to open the glazed press, letter E, on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and draw out with all its contents as they stand the fourth drawer from the top, which is the same thing as the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents. Some powders, a vial, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. That is the first part of your service. Now for the second. You should be back if you set out at once on the receipt of this long before midnight, but I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented or foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterward, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, laboring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save. Your friend, Henry Jekyll. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon reading of this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane, but till that was proven beyond possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was waiting my arrival. He had received the same post as mine, a registered letter of instruction, and had set up at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theater, from which, you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed that he would have great trouble, and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture, and when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white color. The vial, to which I next turned my attention, might have been about half full of blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book, and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago quite abruptly. Here and there, a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, doable, occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation, total failure. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. Here were a vial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease, and though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defense. 12 o'clock had scarce rang out over London ere the knocker sounded gently on the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Are you come from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He told me yes by a constrained gesture, and when I had bidden him to enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the dark of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's eye open, and at the sight I thought my visitor started and made greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here at last I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before, that much was certain. He was small, as I have said, and I was struck besides with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution. And last, but not least, was the odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood. This bore some resemblance to incipient rigor, and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms, but I have since had reason to believe the cause much lies deeper in the nature of this man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principles of mere hatred. This person, who had thus from the first moment of his interest struck me with what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity, he was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measure. The trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of the coat below his haunches, the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, revolting. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit with and reinforce it, so that my interest in the man's nature and character, there was also an added curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and his status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with somber excitement. "Have you got it?" he cried. "Have you got it?" And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang in my blood. "Come, sir," said I, "you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example and sat myself down in my customary seat, and with as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient as to the lateness of the hour, the nature of my preoccupation, and the horror I had of this visitor would suffer me to muster. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied, civilly enough. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the insistence of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understand—" He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see in spite of his collected manner that he was wrestling against the approach of hysteria. "I understood a drawer—" But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," I said, pointing to the drawer where it lay on the floor behind the table and still covered with the sheet. He sprang to it, and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, and his face was so ghastly to see I was alarmed both for his life and reason. "Compose yourself," I said. He turned a dreadful smile to me, and as if with the decision of despair plucked away the sheet. At the sight of the contents, he uttered one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified. At the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, "Have you got a graduated glass?" he asked. I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mix, which at first was of a reddish hue, began, in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in color, to effervesce audibly, and throw off small fumes of vapor. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. "And now," said he, "to settle what remains. Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and go forth from your house without further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of richness of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose, a new province of knowledge and new avenues of fame and power shall be laid open to you, here in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan." "Sir," I said, affecting a coolness that I was far from possessing, "you speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear with you no very strong impression of belief. But I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before seeing the end." "It is well," replied my visitor. "Lanyon, You remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. And now you, who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine. You, who have derided your superiors. Behold. He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed, and he reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with an open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter, and the next moment I had sprung to my feet and leapt back against the wall, my arm raised to shield me from that prodigy, and my mind submerged in terror. "Oh God!" I screamed, and "Oh God!" again and again, for there, before my very eyes, pale and shaken and half fainting, groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. What he told me in the next hour, I cannot bring my mind to set upon paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. And yet now, when that sight is faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night, and I feel my days are numbered, and that I must die, and yet I die incredulous. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence, I cannot, even in memory, dwell upon it without a start of horror. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner as the murderer of Carew. That was signed Hasty Lanyon. And that is the end of that chapter. Not quite the end of the mystery, but definitely Dr. Lanyon, well, now we know what caused him to sicken on to death. And yeah, we have one more chapter left, which we will venture into once I get a drink. Drink obtained, and with some mystery solved, let us move on to the final chapter of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, titled Henry Jekyll's Full Statement of the Case. I was born in the 1800s to a large fortune, endowed besides with excellent parts, inclined by nature to industry, fond of the respect of the wise, and good among my fellow men, and thus, it might have been supposed, with every guarantee of an honorable and distinguished future. And indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition, such as been made the happiness of many, but such as I found hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear more than a common grave countenance before the public. Hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures, and that when I reached years of reflection and began to look round me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. Many a man would have even blazoned such irregularities as I was guilty of, but from the high views that I had set before me, I regarded and hid them with an almost morbid sense of shame. It was thus rather the exacting nature of my aspirations rather than any particular degradation of my faults, that made me what I was, and with an even deeper trench than the majority of men, served me in those provinces of good and ill which divide and compound a man's dual nature. In this case, I was driven to reflect deeply and inevitably on that hard law of life which lies at the root of religion and is one of the most plentiful springs of distress. Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame than when I labored in the eye of day at the forbearance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering. And it chanced that the direction of my scientific studies, which led wholly toward the mystic and the transcendental, reacted and shed a strong light on this consciousness of the perennial war among my members. With every day, and from both sides of my intelligence, the moral and the intellectual, I thus drew steadily nearer to that truth by whose partial discovery I have been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck, that man is not truly one, but truly two. I say two, because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow. Others will outstrip me in the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent desians. I, for my part, from the nature of my life, advanced infallibly in one direction and one direction only. It was on the moral side and in my own person that I learned to recognize the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that, of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both, and from an early date, even before the course of my scientific discoveries, I had begun to suggest the most naked possibility of such a miracle. I had learned to dwell with pleasure, as a beloved daydream, on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could but be housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable, unjust, could go along their way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright half, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found his pleasure, and no longer exposed to the disgrace and the penitence by the hands of the evil side. It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous bits were bound together, that in the agonized womb of consciousness these polar twins should be continually struggling. How then were they disassociated? I was so far in my reflections when, as I have said, a side light began to shine upon the subject from the laboratory table. I began to perceive more deeply than it has ever yet been stated the trembling immateriality, the mist-like transience of this seemingly so solid body in which we walk attired. Certain agents, I have found, have the power to shake and pluck back that fleshy vestment, even as a wind might toss the curtains of a pavilion. For two good reasons, I will not enter deeply into this scientific branch of my confession. First, because I have been made to learn that the doom and burden of our life is forever on man's shoulders, and when the attempt is made to cast it off, it but returns with more unfamiliar and awful pressure. Second, because as my narrative will make a last too evident, my discoveries were incomplete. Even then, that I not only recognize my natural body for the mere aura and effulgence of certain of the powers that make up my spirit, but manage to compound a drug by which these powers should be dethroned from their supremacy, and a second form and countenance substituted, none the less natural to me because they were the expression and bore the stamp of the lower elements of my soul. I hesitate long before I put this theory to the test of practice. I did know that I risked death, for any drug that is so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity might, by the least scruple of overdose, or at least inopportunity in the moment of exhibition, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked it to change. But the temptation of a discovery so singular and profound at last overcame my suggestions of alarm. I had long since prepared my tincture. I purchased at once from a firm of wholesale chemists a large quantity of a particular salt, which I knew from my experiments to be the last ingredient it required. And one late, accursed night, I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in the glass, and when it subsided, with a strong glow of courage, I drank off the potion. The most racking pangs succeeded, a grinding of the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. Then the agonies began to swiftly subside, and I came to myself as if out of a great sickness. There was something strange in my sensations, something indescribably new, and from its very novelty, incredibly sweet. I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered, sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not an innocent freedom of the soul. I knew myself at the first breath of this new life to be more wicked, tenfold more wicked, and sold a slave to my original evil, and the thought in that moment braced and delighted me like wine. I stretched out my hands, exulting in the freshness of these sensations, and in the act, I was suddenly aware that I had lost stature. There was no mirror at that date in my room. That which stands beside me as I write was brought there later, and for the very purpose of these transformations. The night, however, was far gone into the morning. The morning, black as it was nearly ripe for the conception of the day. The inmates of my house were locked in the most rigorous hours of slumber, and I determined, flushed as I was with hope and triumph, to venture in my new shape as far as to my bedroom. I crossed the yard, wherein the constellations looked down upon me. I could have thought with wonder the first creature of that sort that their unsleeping vigilance had yet disclosed to them. I stole through the corridors, a stranger in my own house, and coming to my room, I saw for the first time the appearance of Edward Hyde. I must here speak by theory alone, saying not that which I know, but that which I suppose to be most probable. The evil side of my nature, to which I had now transferred the stamping efficacy, was less robust and less developed than the good which I had just deposed. Again, in the course of my life, which had been, after all, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control, it had been much less exercised and much less exhausted, and thus I think it came about that Edward Hyde was so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll. Even as good shone upon the countenance of one, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other. Evil, besides, which I must still believe to be the lethal side of man, had left on his body the imprint of deformity and decay, and yet when I looked upon that ugly idol in the glass, I was conscious of no repugnance, rather of a leap of welcome. This, too, was myself. It seemed natural and human. In my eyes, it bore a livelier image of spirit. It seemed to express the single, imperfect, divine countenance that I had been beforehand accustomed to call my own. And in this I was doubtless right. I have observed that when I wore the semblance of Edward Hyde, none could come near to me at first without a visible misgiving of their flesh. This, as I take it, was because all human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. I lingered but a moment in the mirror. The second and conclusive experiment had yet to be attempted, and yet it remained to be seen if I had lost my identity beyond redemption and must flee before daylight from a house that was no longer mine. Hurrying back to my cabinet, I once more prepared and drank the cup, once more suffered the pangs of dissolution, and came to myself once more with the character, stature, and face of Henry Jekyll. That night, I had come to a fatal crossroads. Had I approached my discovery with a more noble spirit, had I risked the experiment while under the empire of generous or pious aspirations, all must have been otherwise, and from these agonies of death and birth, I had come forth an angel instead of a fiend. The drug had no discriminating action. It was neither diabolical nor divine, but it shook the doors of the prison house of my disposition, and, like the captives of Philippi, that which stood within ran forward. And that time my virtue slumbered. My evil, kept awake by ambition, was alert and swift to seize upon the occasion, and the first thing that was projected was Edward Hyde. Hence, although I now had two characters as well as two appearances, one was wholly evil and the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair upon. The movement was thus wholly towards the evil. Even at that time, I had not yet conquered my aversion to the dryness of a life of study. I would still be merrily disposed at times, and as my pleasures were, to say the least, undignified, and I was not only well known and highly considered, but growing towards the elderly man, this incoherency of my life was daily growing more unwelcome. It was on this side that my new power tempted me until I fell into its slavery. I had but to drink the cup, to doff at once the body of the noted professor, and to assume like a thick cloak the one of Edward Hyde. I smiled at the notion. It seemed to me at the time humorous, and I made my preparations with the most studious care. I took and furnished the house in Soho to which Hyde was tracked by the police, and I engaged as a housekeeper the creature who I well knew to be silent and unscrupulous. On the other side, I announced to my servants that a Mr. Hyde, who I described to them, was to have full liberty and power about my home in the square, and to Perry, perhaps, I even called and made myself a familiar object in my second character. I next drew up that will to which you so much objected, so that if anything befell me in the person of Dr. Jekyll, I could enter on that of Edward Hyde without losing money. And thus forfeited, I supposed, on every side, I began to profit by the strange immunity of my position. Men have before hired bravos to transact their crimes, while their own person and reputation sat under shelter. I was the first that ever did so for his own pleasure. I was the first that could thus plod in the public eye with a load of genial respectability, and in a moment like a schoolboy strip off these lendings and spring headlong into the sea of liberty. But for me, my impenetrable manner of the safety was complete. Think of it. I did not even exist. Let me but escape into my laboratory door, give me but a second or two to mix and swallow the draught that I always had standing ready, and whatever he had done, Edward Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon the mirror, and there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at these suspicions would be Henry Jekyll. The pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I said, undignified. I would scarce use a harder term. But in the hands of Edward Hyde, they soon began to turn towards the monstrous. When I would come back from these excursions, I was often plunged into a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. This familiar, that I called out of my own soul and set forth alone to do his good pleasure, was a being inherently malign and villainous. His every act and thought centered on self, drinking pleasure with a bestial avidity from any degree of torture to another. Relentless, he was like a man of stone. Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, but the situation was apart from ordinary laws and insidiously relaxed the gasp of my conscience. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. Jekyll was no worse. He woke again to his good qualities, seemingly unimpaired, and he would even make haste, where it was possible, to undo the evils done by Hyde, and thus his conscience slumbered. Into the details of the infamy at which I am thus convinced, for even now I can scarce grant that I committed it, but into that I have no design of entering. I mean but to point out the warnings and the successive steps with which my chastisement approached. I met with one accident, which, as it brought on no consequence, I shall no more than mention. An act of cruelty to a child aroused against me the anger of a passer-by, whom I recognized the other day in the person of your kinsman. The doctor and the child's family joined him, and there were moments where I feared for my life, and at last, in order to pacify their far too just resentment, Edward Hyde had them had Edward Hyde had to bring them to the door and pay them with a check drawn in the name of Henry Jekyll. But this danger was easily eliminated from the future by opening an account at another bank in the name of Edward Hyde himself, and when, by sloping my own hand backward, I had supplied my double with the signature, I thought that I sat beyond the reach of fate. Some 2 months before the murder of Sir Danvers, I had been out for one of my adventures, and had returned at a late hour, and woke the next day in bed with somewhat odd sensations. It was in vain I looked about me. In vain I saw the decent furniture and the tall proportions of my room in the square. In vain that I recognized the pattern of the bed curtains and the design of the mahogany frame. Something still kept insisting that I was not where I was, that I had not wakened where I seemed to be, but in the little room in Soho where I was accustomed to sleep in the body of Edward Hyde. I smiled to myself. In my psychological way, I began lazily to inquire into the elements of this illusion, occasionally, even as I did so, dropping back into a comforting morning doze. I was still so engaged when in one of my more wakeful moments, my eyes fell upon my hand. Now, the hand of Henry Jekyll, as you have often remarked, was professional in shape and size. It was large, firm, white, and comely, but the hand which I now saw clear enough in the yellow light of a mid-morning in London, lying half closed on the bed sheets, was lean, corded, knuckly, of a dusky pallor, and thickly shadowed with a growth of hair. It was the hand of Edward Hyde. I must have stared upon it for nearly half a minute, sunk as I was in the stupidity of wonder, before terror woke in me as sudden and startling as the crash of cymbals, and bounding from my bed, I rushed to the mirror. At the sight that met my eyes, my blood was changed into something exquisitely thin and icy. Yes, I had gone to bed Henry Jekyll, and I had awakened Edward Hyde. How was this to be explained? I asked myself. And then, with another bound of terror, how was it to be remedied? It was well on in the morning. The servants were up. My drugs were in the cabinet. A long journey down 2 flights of stairs, through the back passage, across the open court, and through the anatomical theater, from where I was standing horror-struck then. It might indeed be possible to cover my face, but of what use was that when I was unable to conceal the alteration in my stature? And then, with an overpowering sweetness of relief, it came back upon my mind that the servants were already used to the comings and goings of my second self. I had soon dressed, as well as I was able, in the clothes of my own size, and soon passed through the house, where Bradshaw stared and drew back at seeing Mr. Hyde at such an hour, and in such strange attire. And then 10 minutes later, Dr. Jekyll returned in his own shape, and was sitting down with a darkened brew to make a feint of breakfast. Small indeed, though, was my appetite. This inexplicable incident, this reversal of my previous experience, seemed like the Babylonian finger on the wall, to be spelling out the letters of my judgment, and I began to reflect more seriously than ever before on the issues and possibilities of my double existence. That part of me which I had the power of projecting had lately been much exercised and nourished, and it seemed to me of late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, as though, when I wore the form, I were conscious of a more generous tide of blood, and I began to spy a danger in that. If this were much prolonged, the balance of my nature might be permanently overthrown, with the power of voluntary change forfeited, and the character of Edward Hyde might become irrevocably mine. The power of the drug had not always equally displayed. Once, early in my career, it had totally failed me. Since then, I had been obliged on more than one occasion to double, and once, with infinite risk of death, treble the amount. And those rare uncertainties had cast hereto the sole shadow of my contentment. Now, however, and in the light of that morning's accidents, I was led to remark that whereas in the beginning the difficulty had been to throw off the body of Dr. Jekyll, it had lately, gradually but decidedly, transferred itself the other way. All things, therefore, seemed to point to this. I was slowly losing my hold of my original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated in with my second and worse half. Between these, I now felt I had to choose. My two natures had memory in common, but all other facilities were most unequally shared between them. Jekyll, who was composite, now with the most sensitive apprehension, now with greedy gusto, projected and shared in the pleasure and adventure of Hyde, but Hyde was indifferent to Jekyll. or but remembered him as the mountain bandit remembers the cavern in which he hides himself from pursuit. Jekyll had more than a father's interest, and Hyde had more than a son's indifference. To cast my lot with Jekyll was to die to those appetites that I had long secretly indulged and had of late began to pamper. To cast my lot with Hyde was to die to 1,000 interests and aspirations and to become at a blow and forever despised and friendless. The bargain might appear unequal, but there was still another consideration on the scales. For while Jekyll would suffer smartingly in the fires of abstinence, Hyde would not be even conscious of everything he had lost. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and common as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted, trembling sinner, and it fell out with me as it falls out with so many of my fellows, that I chose the better part and was found wanting in the strength to keep to it. Yes, I preferred the elderly and discontent doctor, surrounded by friends and cherishing honest hopes, and I bade a resolute farewell to the liberty, the comparative youth, the light step, the leaping impulses, and the secret pleasures that I had enjoyed in the disguise of Hyde. I made this choice, perhaps with some unconscious reservation, for I neither gave up the house in Soho nor destroyed the clothing of Edward Hyde, which still lay ready in my cabinet. For 2 months, however, I was true to my determination. For 2 months, I led a life of such severity as I had never before attained to, and enjoyed the compensations of an approving conscience. But time began at last to obliterate the freshness of my alarm. The praises of my conscience began to grow into a thing of course, and I began to be tortured with throes of longing, as of Hyde struggling for freedom. And at last, in an hour of moral weakness, I once again compounded and swallowed the transforming draught. I do not suppose that when a drunkard reasons with himself upon his vice, he is once out of 500 times affected by the dangers that he runs through his brutish physical insensibility. Neither had I, as long as I had considered my position, made enough allowance for the complete moral insensibility and readiness to evil which were the leading characteristics of Edward Hyde. Yet it was by those that I was punished. My devil had been long caged and came out roaring. I was conscious, even when I took the draught, of a more unbridled, a more furious propensity to ill. It must have been this, I suppose, that stirred my soul, that tempest of impatience with which I listened to the civilities of my unhappy victim. I declare, at least before God, no man morally sane could have been guilty of that crime upon so pitiful a provocation, and that I struck in no reasonable spirit that in which a sick child might break a plaything. It was like that. But I had voluntarily stripped myself of all of those balancing instincts by which even the worst of us continues to walk with some degree of steadiness amongst temptation. And in my case, to be tempted, even slightly, was to fall. Instantly, the spirit of hell awoke in me enraged. With a transport of glee, I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight with every blow. And it was not until weariness had began to succeed that I was suddenly, at the top fit of my delirium, struck through the heart by a cold thrill of terror. A mist dispersed, and I saw my life to be forfeit, and I fled from the scene of these excesses, at once glorying and trembling, my lust of evil gratified and stimulated, My love of life screwed to the utmost peg, I ran to the house in Soho, and to make assurance doubly sure, I destroyed my papers and then sent out through the lamplit streets the same divided ecstasy of mind, gloating upon my crime, light-heartedly devising more in the future, and yet still hastening and hearkening in my wake for the steps of the avenger. Hyde had a song upon his lips as he compounded the draught, and as he drank it, he pledged the dead man. The pangs of transformation had not done tearing through him before Dr. Jekyll, with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse, had fallen on his knees, lifted his hands to God. The veil of self-indulgence was rent from head to foot, and I saw my life as a whole. I followed it up from the days of childhood when I had walked with my father's hand, and through the self-denying toils of my professional life, to arrive again and again with the same sense of unreality at the damned horrors of the evening. I could have screamed. I sought with tears and prayers to smother down the crowd of hideous images and sounds with which my memory swarmed up against me, and still between petitions the ugly face of my iniquity stared into my soul. As the acuteness of this remorse began to die away, it followed with a sense of joy. The problem of my conduct was solved. Hyde was thenceforth impossible, whether I would or not. I was now confined the better part of my existence, and oh, how I rejoiced to think about it. With what willing humility I embraced anew the restrictions of a natural life. With what sincere renunciation I locked the door by which I had so often come and gone, and I ground the key under my heel. The next day came the news that the murder had been overlooked, that the guilt of Hyde was patent to the world. It was not only a crime, it had been a tragic folly. I think that I was glad to know it. I think that I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. Jekyll was now my city of refuge. Let but Hyde peep out an instant, and the hand of all men would be raised to take and kill him. I resolved in my future to conduct and redeem the past, and I can say with honesty that my resolve was fruitful of some good. You know yourself how earnestly in the last months of the last year I labored to relieve suffering. You know that much was done for others, and that the days passed quietly, almost happily for myself. Nor can I truly say that I wearied of this beneficent and innocent life. I think instead that I daily enjoyed it more completely, but I was still cursed with my duality of purpose. And as the first edge of my penitence wore off, the lower side of me, so long indulged and so recently chained, began to growl for freedom. Not that I dreamed of resuscitating Hyde. The bare idea of that would startle me to a frenzy. No, it was in my own person that I was once more tempted to trifle with my conscience. And it was as an ordinary secret sinner that I at last fell before the assault of temptation. There comes an end to all things. The most capricious measure is filled at last, and this brief condensation to my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul, and yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I had made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet under the foot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Place was full of winter chirrupings and sweet with spring odors. I sat in the sun on a bench, the animal within me licking its chops of memory, the spiritual side drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin it. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbors, and then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at that very moment, a vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea, and the most deathly shuddering. These passed away, and they left me faint. And then, as its turn, the faintness subsided, I began to be aware of the change in the temper of my thoughts. A greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution to the bounds of obligation. I looked down. My clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that lay on my knee was corded and hairy, and I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the cloth laying for me in the dining room at home, and now I was the common quarry of mankind, hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. My reason wavered, but did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that in my second character, my facilities seem sharpened to a point and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus, it came about that where Jekyll might perhaps have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. Had to sneeze. Thus, it came about where Jekyll might perhaps have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet, but how was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solving. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw that I must employ another hand, and I thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached, and how persuaded? Supposing that I escaped capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into his presence? And how should I, unknown and a displeasing visitor, prevail upon the famous physician to rifle the study of his colleague, Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part remained to me. I could write with my own hand, and at once I conceived that kindling spark, the way what I must follow to become lighted from end to end. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best as I could, and summoning a passing hansom, I drove to a hotel on Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however tragic a fate those garments covered, the driver did not conceal his mirth. I gashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face. Happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for in another instant I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn, as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as made the attendants tremble, and not a look did they exchange in my presence, but they took my orders and led me to a private room and brought me things to write with. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a new creature to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain. Yet the creature was astute, and he mastered his fury with a great effort of the will, and he composed his two important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, and that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, he set them out with directions that they should be registered. Thenceforward, he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing at his nails. There he dined, sitting alone with his fears, the waiter visibly quailing before his eyes, and thence, when the night was fully come, he set forth in the corner of a closed cab and was driven to and fro about the streets of the city. He, I say, I cannot say I, that child of hell had nothing human, nothing lived in him but fear and hate, and when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked for observation, into the midst of the nocturnal passengers, these two passions raged in him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. When I came to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was at least but a drop in the sea to the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows. It was the horror of being Hyde that rankled me. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came home to my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could break. I awoke in the morning shaken and wearied, but refreshed. I still hated and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before, but I was once more at home in my own house and close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul, it almost rivaled the brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change, and I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passion of Hyde. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall me to myself, and alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drug had to be readministered. In short, from that day on, it seemed only by a great effort of gymnastics and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with the shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde I awoke. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I now condemned myself, I, even beyond what I had thought possible to a man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak both in mind and body, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror of my other half. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of the transformation grew daily less, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, into a soul boiling with causeless hatred, and into a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of the creature that shared with him some of the phenomenon of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond the links of community, in which themselves made the most poignant part of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all of his energy of life, as something not only hellish, but inorganic. This was the shocking thing, that slime of the pit that seemed utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead and had no shape should usurp life. And this again, that astringent horror was knit to him closer than a wife and closer than an eye. It lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and he felt it struggle to be born at every hour of weakness. And in the confidence of slumber, it prevailed against him and deposed him from life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was a different order. His terror of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide and return to his subordinate a station of a part instead of a person. But he hated the necessity. He hated the dependency into which Jekyll had now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he was regarded. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters, destroying the portrait of my father. And indeed had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me with that ruin. But Hyde's love of life is wonderful. I go further. I who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him when I recall the abjection and passion of this attachment, and I, when he knows how he fears my power to cut him off by death, I can find it in my heart to pity him then. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me to prolong the description. No one has ever suffered such torment. Let that suffice. And yet, even to these, habit brought, no, not alleviation, but a certain callousness of soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, except for the last calamity which has now fallen, and which has finally severed me from my own face and nature. My provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the date of the first experiment, began running low. I sent out for a fresh supply, and I mixed the draught. The foaming followed, and the first change of color, but not the second. I drank it, and it was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole how I have had London ransacked, and it was in vain. And I am now persuaded that my first supply must have been impure, and that it was the unknown impurity which let its efficiency into the draught. About a week has passed, and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. This, then, is the last time, shy of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts or see his own face, so sadly altered now in the glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end, for if my narrative has herefore escaped destruction, it has been by a combination of prudence and great good luck. Should the throes of the change take me in the act of writing this, Hyde will tear it to pieces, but if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wonderful selfishness and circumspection to the moment will probably save it once again from the action of his apish spite. And indeed, the doom that is closing on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever reside in that hated personality, I know how I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening, pace up and down the room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold? Or will he find the courage to release himself in the last moment? God knows I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what will follow concerns someone other than myself. Here, then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to its end. And that is how the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde ends. So, one interesting thing that I did find out about this is that Robert Louis Stevenson actually wrote it as a very thinly veiled, I guess, biography of a doctor that he actually knew. And by thinly veiled, it was known to Robert Louis Stevenson that the doctor that he knew was a gay man, and he was leading a dual life. And when he thought about his very good friend who was leading this double life, pretty much a lot of the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of entered into his mind. And he actually wrote it in a very short amount of time. And he gave it to his wife to read, and she told him that it was too veiled. It wasn't explicit enough that he was writing about the duality of man, and that he should rewrite it. So he did, and evidently it took less than 2 weeks to write the story, so he was definitely a man possessed. And it's an interesting thing to think about. The language is a bit more stilted, I think, at times than a modern novel, and it felt like it was a little bit slower to get going, but I can see how this story kind of snagged in people's consciousness for a long time after. So I have also decided that we are going to read these 3 stories, which are attributed to Charles Dickens, but evidently none of the 3 of these stories were actually written by Charles Dickens. 2 of them were written by a William Howitt or Hewitt, a contemporary of Dickens, but definitely not Charles Dickens himself. And the third one, from what I have been able to see, no one actually knows who wrote it. So that should be pretty interesting. The first one we will be starting with when next we meet is going to be Fortune Wildred the Foundling. And I think that is the one that was written by who knows who. And I think Lizzie Lay and the Miner's Daughters were both written by this William Hewitt or Howitt. I will write that down and probably put a little paper in that book so I don't forget the man's name. But yes, thank you so much for joining me in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I hope that you enjoyed the story as much as I did, and if so, leave me a thumbs up. If you're interested in sticking around and reading more of these classics, and maybe even not so classic, because I went venturing out to a store that sells all sorts of things, including very old books, and I found a bunch more very old books. So we might eventually read all of those too and just see what our ancestors were into. But anyway, thank you for listening. As I said, leave me a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you're not already, and I will see you next time.